I'm a moral agent. A plant is not. So with biocentrism, especially, something like the following is true. There are more cells inside my body that don't have my genome than do, like E. coli in my gut and all these other sorts of things. If it's true that every living thing is morally considerable, then every bacterium is morally considerable. So I just don't really know what to do with that from a practical moral point of view. And I think that that flattening of the moral universe ends up cheapening obligation to such an incredible degree that I just don't find that view plausible, because I've walked through the arguments for ecocentrism and biocentrism, and part of me sort of wants there to be a there, but I'm not sure that there is.
Hey, Joel, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself, Jamie?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, thank you so much. It's great to get the chance to talk to you. I first came across your work because my ears pricked up when I saw the title of your PhD dissertation, which was Minding Nature, a Defense of the Sentiocentric Approach to Environmental Ethics. And given my biases, I was like, if this guy is defending sentiocentrism, he must be right because I agree with him. So it was great to sort of dig into that dissertation and reach out to you there. So we've been in touch for a while, and it's been great to have you in our Sentientism Facebook group too. So it's wonderful to have a proper conversation with you here. And as you know, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest and most important philosophical questions about how we should best understand this weird reality we all share and what tools we should use to try and engage with that, the sort of what's real question, but then just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics, what matters and critically who matters in our moral consideration. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop sentientism as a really broad pluralistic worldview that suggests, in response to the what's real question, that we should use a very broadly construed naturalistic approach using evidence and reason and a healthy dose of humility to try and understand reality as far as we can. And then on the moral and ethical side, it's very pluralistic in what system we apply, but it does insist that every sentient being, any being that has the capacity to feel or to experience, should be included seriously in our moral considerations. Hence, evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings being the sort of strapline. But I'm talking in these conversations to a dazzling variety of minds, some of whom agree and some of whom don't. So it'll be really interesting to understand your own philosophical journey and how that plays into the work you do now. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for those who don't know of your work already?
Yeah, so, I'm a philosopher by training, assistant professor of philosophy at Loyola University New Orleans. So I live in a place that's sort of deeply impacted by climate change and is vulnerable in many ways there. Relatedly, I'm affiliate faculty in the environment program. I guess it's not really a secret anymore, but I'm the director-elect of the environment program. So starting in August for the next couple of years, I'll be heading the environment program. I also coach the Ethics Bowl, so I work with students outside the classroom to try to develop sort of critical thinking capacities. I do some stuff, not sort of in a research context, like not my writing, but just worth mentioning on our institutional review board for the international folks that has to do with any kind of research involving human subjects. I'm the ethicist on that board now. And also relatedly, I'm the non-scientist member on our IACUC, the Loyola's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. Loyola is a very small liberal arts school. They hardly do any animal research, nothing like the big brother next door, Tulane, which has been deeply involved, for example, in primate research and things like that. But yes, that's sort of my current position. I've held visiting positions at Binghamton University and Washington State University in New York and Washington, respectively. I did my PhD back at the University of Tennessee up in Knoxville. Probably worth pointing out that I was a community environmental conservation Peace Corps volunteer in Panama. So between undergraduate and graduate work, I lived in rural Panama. So a little bit of perspective. I lived in a community of 27 houses that you had to cross the pedestrian bridge with semi-potable water, no sewage system, a one-room schoolhouse that I taught in. It was something like a 10-hour trip from Panama City, so pretty remote, all by myself. Culturally, at least, I had a community of about 150 people, but that was a pretty interesting and impactful experience just in general, and with respect to sort of human animal studies and our relationship with nature. Let's see, I did my undergraduate work in my hometown, which is the University of Akron, so major in philosophy. I had a certificate of environmental studies and also a minor in bioethics, so kind of a longstanding interest in life, ethics with respect to life, basically. I actually didn't want to go to college initially. I was a bit too much of a free spirit, but I ended up taking a semester off after 1 year. My parents basically said, do a year and then maybe decide like if you want this to do this or not. And I ended up, of course, it worked out for me in the end. But as far as my work, let's see. So I'm trained in the Anglo-American analytic tradition of philosophical inquiry. So in other words, an emphasis on sort of tight, clear argumentation and conceptual analysis, less so like in the continental side, which emphasizes, depth, but not necessarily clarity. But I do have some sort of interest, at least early in my career, in phenomenology and existentialism, but it hasn't really featured in my writing and my research. So research-wise, yeah, I mostly work in applied ethics, especially environmental ethics and animal ethics, and especially the intersection of those. Also, relatedly, some further interests in philosophy of science, but especially the philosophy of biology, kind of to better understand the sort of theoretical and empirical side of the things that I think matter morally. And also some passing research interests in the history of early modern philosophy, especially the British empiricists, which I suspect that might be of interest to folks on the other side of the pond, as it were. Most of my publications are in things like animal ethics and the intersection of animal and environmental ethics, but I've got some publications, let's see, one in environmental pragmatism, one in sort of intergenerational justice from a kind of Rawlsian point of view. Yeah, and then maybe just sort of personally by way of like early life, I grew up in a suburb of Akron, Ohio. So just a little bit of perspective, not rural, but like we grew up on a fairly large tract of land, think, 20 mature oak trees in the front yard. The backyard directly abutted a steep ravine that I would just so I was kind of a latchkey kid of the 80s, basically. And the ravine went all the way down to the Cuyahoga River. You might not have heard of the Cuyahoga River, but it was super important in early US environmental history, at least, the most recent wave of like the 1960s and 70s, because that was the river that literally caught in fire. So that was sort of my playground growing up, was about a half a mile down the ravine. My parents would just let us go. Their only rule was don't go above your knees when getting in the water. Because even though it had been cleaned up a lot by then, it wasn't clean at that time. But that just led to a lot of sort of early exposure of just sort of being in and messing around in nature and with animals. So lots of experience with birds. I kept a lot of herpetofauna. So, I raised tadpoles to frogs and kept a couple of garter snakes that I would later release, and then also rescued some animals that were dumped because it was semi-rural where we were. It was pretty out there. So we ended up rescuing literally 2 dogs that had been left at like the local train tracks as I grew up. I didn't have much of an imagination, though. I named the first one Boy because it's come here, boy. But it turns out it was a girl. But that sort of patriarchal bias sort of stuck accidentally. So we called the girl Boy her whole life. And then later, that was a collie mix. And then later was a Doberman mix that I unimaginably named Trax because, again, found him on the train tracks. But yes, that's just a little bit there. My mother was a nurse, so I early experience in neonatal intensive care units. That kind of informed my interest in medical ethics, of just seeing sort of the fragility of life very early on. And my dad was the heir to a area set of musical instrument retail stores, basically. So I grew up around music and art a lot, and that's kind of been hobbies of mine. So yeah, and as far as hobbies go, all manner of outdoor adventuring. I've done mountaineering, rock climbing, kayaking, all that sort of stuff. Lots of interest in music. And I'm a pretty hardcore board gamer by way of hobbies. Think sort of Catan, but on steroids. And that kind of touches with a lot of this stuff. There's been a lot of really interesting things in the last couple of years, like card games called Evolution, Wingspan. So a lot of sort of nature-themed board games are something I have an interest in as well. So that's sort of a bit of bio of how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, thank you. It's painted a great portrait, and your work's fascinating because obviously there's the research, but you're all directly involved in some very practical ethics questions as well. Real grounded stuff where you're taking calls and that oversight in those committees, and in public philosophy through the ethics bowl and so on as well. So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, I try to be. So within philosophy, applied ethics can be a bit of a pejorative that it's not, according to some philosophers, it's not real philosophy because it doesn't get to those foundational issues. So for some philosophers, it's not philosophical enough. But then, of course, for most people, even many academics, applied ethics is already too philosophical. So I've always tried to sort of strike that balance. I remember like when I was graduating undergraduate, my mentor was like, do I want to go into applied fields? Like, because some philosophers do things like just sort of like existential psychology and things like that, or practical. I was also into some activist sort of things with respect to environment, animals, and social justice issues. So I was pretty well known on campus for being, someone who's politically active. So there was a lot of thought that I might go in that direction. So he's like, do you want to be an academic or do you want to do something else? And I always said, yes. The answer was both. I tried to delay that decision by going to Peace Corps, and I'm still trying to delay answering the question what I want to be when I grow up. But we'll see.
That can run and run. Don't worry. You can do it for decades. Let's start with the first of those big philosophical questions then, the what's real questions of epistemology and, how do we understand the universe? And that's a very broad question because it covers every field of potential human belief and credence, but often an interesting way into it is to understand my guest's journey with respect to the big questions of, religion, the spiritual, the supernatural, and whether they grew up in that sort of environment or one that was maybe more naturalistic, scientific, atheistic, agnostic or something, and how that side of their thinking has changed over their life if it has. And you've got a wonderful backdrop there to sort of set the scene for that question.
Well, you're starting with the easy questions I see here. Jeez.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess I'll start with the sort of biographical answer. So I was raised in a minimally Protestant Christian family. What do I mean by minimally Protestant? So we went to church on Sundays, and that was about it. I wasn't raised deeply religious, like no prayer before meals. We didn't do like Bible reading, stuff like that. So I talked to my parents about that kind of relatively early, so my mom, she was more spiritual than religious. I was like, so why do we go to church? And the direct answer seems to be like, she liked singing in choir and that kind of sense of community, but it wasn't, I don't think at least a sort of deep, specifically Christian kind of religious point of view. And with respect to my father, I asked, why do we go to church? And his answer was even less important. He said, we go to church because that's what we're supposed to do, was pretty much his answer. So I guess I had a religious upbringing by way of sort of how not to do it. And I do think that sort of that inauthenticity there kind of impacted me a lot, that like we're just kind of going through the motions, but there wasn't sort of any real commitment with respect to the worldview that was going on there.
And what did you think of that at the time? What was your response to that?
Well, I'll just say that I've never been religious or spiritual. I mean, I guess people have different views about that, but I think that we're all born atheistic, at least in the sense that we don't have any active beliefs in anything supernatural. I think we're sort of we start as empiricists and maybe branch out from there, maybe not. So for a while, I mean, in some respects, I mean, just to be frank, I thought I might have been like broken or something. Like, what's the statistic? Like what percent of people are religious worldwide? I want to say it's like 80 something percent, 85%, somewhere in there. So yeah, I was like, okay, the overwhelming majority of people think this thing. I don't really think any of that stuff. Like, am I missing something? So I thought there might have been something sort of fundamental to the human experience I just kind of didn't get. But yeah, suffice to say, appeals to the supernatural never really have done anything for me. I suppose in retrospect, I did not go to college as a philosopher. It wasn't until my junior year that I sort of decided that as my major, but perhaps it's the case that I had certain philosophical aptitudes at an early age. So maybe like an anecdote here, there would be, church for about an hour, and then adults would do their thing, and then the kids would be off in like the Bible study classrooms. And a lot of that was positively unhelpful in terms of trying, like, because think about it, a Sunday school teacher it's just basically a mom babysitting, more or less, was what it was. So, the story of Noah's Ark, but I was probably 10 when this was happening or somewhere around there. And, all the animals 2 and 2 fit on there, but I'd already had a deep experience of nature. I'm like, wait, there's so many species of beetles. This doesn't make any sense at all. And then just kind of, just basic critical thinking, a lot of these beliefs, at least if taken literally, about, the treating the Bible as like a matter of documenting historic records, seem to me to just be non-starters as early as like 5 years old or something like that. But a lot of that probably speaks more to my anti-authoritarian and anti-dogmatism which I think in some respects are two sides of the same coin. So yeah, it impacts me in that way. And so I don't want to say like I'm probably an atheist according to sort of the standard textbook definition, at least a weak atheist, that is an absence of a belief in God. Probably also an agnostic, not in the sort of strong epistemological sense where I don't think we can know, like at least according to some definitions of knowledge, that the supernatural exists or doesn't exist. So, for example, another anecdote might be helpful here. When I was around 12, when we were signing into church, a member of this church, not a member of this church, and then wish to join this church was a third category. I must have been feeling pretty cavalier that day, but I always wrote my name under not a member of this church. But then that day I put wish to be a member of this church, but I put do not above that category. So do not wish to be a member of this church. So that got an invite by the pastor with the parents where I was asked to apologize, but I refused. I was like, no, I don't refuse because I don't wish to be a member of this church. I'm sort of here under duress against my will. It's always been that way. And
what age were you then?
Around 10 or 12.
That's pretty brave. Yeah.
Yeah. So suffice to say, I didn't have to go to church anymore after that. So my parents were pretty cool about that in the grand scheme of things. They kind of let me find my own way. I think they were really, they created a sort of positive environment for me to sort of explore the world, find my own way, and that kind of thing. So yeah, and then in college, I got into, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, all that sort of stuff, like the new atheists. And I learned a lot from that, but just sort of, you'd mentioned humility opening. I always struck the way that they thought about these things and talked about these things struck me as kind of divisive and not welcoming to people that might be open to hearing what you have to say if you're not actively ridiculing them. So what's the saying? You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Actually, that's not true. Best I can tell, flies are quite attracted to vinegar and not to honey. But in any case, yeah, you don't really win over people by ridiculing them. I think there's a lot to be gained through conversation, that sort of thing. So yeah, maybe I'd just sort of wrap up. I like to say that I grew up atheist, but I'm no longer practicing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm more of one might call an apatheist. Are you familiar with that term,
Yeah,
apatheism? Yeah. So an attitude of sort of apathy or indifference towards the existence or non-existence of God. So yeah, I don't positively affirm or deny the existence of God or the supernatural. It just doesn't really play a role in my life or in my thinking academically. So I guess you could say I'm a naturalist, but I tend to emphasize naturalism more as a method of inquiry and not as an ontology. So in other words, like how I write just treats the world as given. I don't make any assumptions beyond the empirical or what best explains the empirical with respect to sort of supernatural entities. They just don't really play a role in my work. So in some respects, I'm perhaps at least as much skeptical as I am naturalistic, or at least like to think of them kind of in balance. So sort of like David Hume in that respect, although probably not quite as skeptical, depending on how one interprets Hume. So definitely taking the world as empirically given, but also being informed by a healthy dose of skepticism with respect to affirming or denying stuff beyond that.
Thank you. And I think I'm probably in a similar sort of space because I tend to focus on naturalism as used more like the method, the toolkit, the epistemology, more than the ontology itself. Now, for me, my naturalistic epistemology gives me quite high credence in a naturalistic ontology. I think they tie together quite neatly. And in a way, I wonder that if I ever came across some evidence of the supernatural, that would almost by definition make that supernatural thing now part of the natural world because I'd got some sort of naturally grounded evidence of it. So maybe that would automatically bundle anything supernatural into a redefined, broader natural world, right? So there can be this sort of quite tight link between the naturalistic epistemology and the ontology.
Where that becomes sort of question begging, right? Where anything that happens turns out to in fact be natural. But yeah, it is definitely the case that things that we don't understand, we often attribute to beyond naturalistic explanation, but perhaps we can't currently explain them. But that doesn't mean that they're in principle unexplainable or that they're not naturalistic. Like consciousness might be that way, for example.
Yeah, and that's partly why I've ended up focusing more on the epistemology. Hence the sentientism idea is about evidence and reason and compassion, not the natural world is all that exists and there can be no supernatural. It's very much focused on the epistemology, partly because I think there is a danger if we're too insistent on a naturalistic ontology that, like with the new atheist, that can start to feel like maybe it's another dogma, right? It's just if you're too sure of anything, your mind starts to close down. And so I quite like the idea of a naturalistic epistemology, but that has to involve a humility, a comfort with not knowing things, always being uncertain about the strength of your beliefs, wanting to correlate the strength of your credences with the strength of the evidence, and being open-minded about even crazily weird stuff, because physics has shown us that quite a lot of crazily weird stuff is actually a pretty good description of reality. So I quite like that focus on the epistemology without being the temptation of getting dogmatic about naturalistic ontology, if that makes sense.
And speaking about not being dogmatic, so I will just point out that this whole question of naturalism is like really vague in philosophy, and a lot of folks have tried to develop it quite a bit, but that's not really my area. Like, I know some people think that methodological naturalism actually logically commits you to metaphysical naturalism, or what you might call philosophical naturalism, but some deny that. I don't have a developed view there. I hope that's not the case, but I don't know, maybe it is the case. At least as a point of sort of self-branding, I think it's better to start with the methodological than with what you're calling the epistemological and not the metaphysical.
And I also quite like to leave it deliberately a bit fuzzy and vague. And that, for example, the concept of evidence, I think, can be very broad. It's not just, people in lab coats doing randomized controlled trials. I think our personal experiences and the information from our senses, those are types of evidence as well. My personal lived experience is a type of evidence, and we should be skeptical of it and look for corroboration. But I could like to have quite a broad definition of what evidence and reasoning is. And there's risks there as well, right? Because that can take you off track. But I think, I quite like that sort of roughly fuzzy, broad understanding of what we're trying and engage honestly with reality in good faith as a way of understanding it. But
I think there's a way in which there's a certain sort of scientific excess where it's only double-blinded, peer-reviewed clinical trials that are any evidence at all. So like, you have to discredit any personal anecdotes, even by like doctors, for example, that are working in that area and might have some ideas about the causal mechanism of a particular disease and how a particular drug might interact with that, even if it's not yet justified in the sort of gold standard way. But I think science maybe tends a little bit too much in that direction to think that that's the only kind of evidence that matters. I think the way you put it's quite nice about because of course we know from our own experience, and just for example, to connect it with animals, like, I'm sure of Descartes and how he's been beaten to a dead horse, but, the early 20th century with behaviorism and things like that. And then once, with Jane Goodall and not numbering, but rather naming animals. And there was a sort of new way of thinking about, based on our personal experience, what's obviously a conscious being from the sort of the sight test, as it were. But, of course, in some respects, consciousness can be a black box from the scientific point of view. So science is maybe, I don't want to say too objective, but it does produce a certain kind of evidence, but not the only kind of evidence that we can rely on.
Yeah. And just to wrap up this sort of what matters part, your mention of Descartes, I think, is a really interesting example, because sometimes people will ask me, well, why are you insisting on a naturalistic epistemology in this sentientism worldview? Isn't it enough just to focus on the moral scope? And can't we allow people who have a faith-based or a dogmatic or a revelation-based epistemology, isn't that? And Descartes, I think, is an interesting example, because I think he could have rightly claimed that he was sentiocentric in his moral scope. That he could say, I, Descartes, grant moral consideration to all sentient beings. But he, I think, made an epistemological error, which is you can only feel pain if you have a soul, and dogs don't have souls. So I can torture my wife's dog, or, I'm not sure if that story is actually true. But so in a sense, that's quite an interesting example of how someone can claim a genuine, rich, broad compassion, caring about all suffering, but by making an epistemological error that then, mistakes who's capable of suffering. It's just one of many examples of how broken epistemology can warp even a compassionate ethic.
There's Descartes that we talk about now in Descartes' actual views, not to get too deep in the weeds of philosophy, but there's at least some reason to think that what we think Descartes' view was might not have actually been Descartes' view, and is actually more of the post-Descartes Cartesians, because they saw obviously in Descartes' view, if animals don't have souls, then these things like these live vivisection on dogs that seems to be really morally problematic isn't a problem at all. Or then like the theological bent, where all of the suffering in nature if that's not actually happening, then maybe the problem of evil is a lot smaller problem than we had thought. So it's
it makes your theodicy easier.
Yeah, it makes your theodicy easier. But I'm not sure that was actually Descartes' view, at least not as strongly as it's been sort of popularized. Philosophers love a good whipping boy, as it were. Yeah.
Absolutely. When someone's down, you can keep whipping them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, one quick follow-up. So on the sort of the religious thing, I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, because you said a little bit about it, right? You want to do this sort of epistemological naturalism, but not the other kind. But most people are religious, and it's especially true outside of the developed West. I know within the West, at least in the United States, the fastest growing religion is non-religious, which can include the spiritual, but that's kind of definitely on the uptick here. But around the world, it's definitely the case that most people are religious. So how do you sort of think about and address the fact? So if the real idea is sort of practical change to improve relations with non-human animals or something like that, one would think that meeting people where they are would be a sort of most fruitful way of doing it. So I'm just kind of wondering how you juggle those.
Well, so I guess one thing I'd say is that this worldview, this idea, doesn't preclude absolutely joining in common cause with anyone with a sentiocentric compassion, whatever their worldview and whatever their background. So, for example, our online Sentientism communities are open to everybody. We have plenty of religious people, people with spiritual beliefs, people with faith-based beliefs in there, and quite often those people are working together on other projects to do with both intrahuman causes and non-human animal causes. So there's absolutely not this idea that it will be a sort of closed community where certain people can't come in or come out. And we see that in very practical terms. At the same time, I do think it's useful to insist on a philosophical naturalism, partly because I think it's a better grounded approach to the ethical problems and is more robust. And although it doesn't obviate ethical issues, it does remove some. So to my mind, a few of the paths that can take people away from a rich, universal, sentiocentric compassion can include making that compassion conditional on certain rules being followed, conditional on being a member of an in-group or an out-group, conditional on, whether it complies with the divine command theory, conditional on, so there's a bunch of different reasons that can, but don't always, but can come from a fideistic or a revelation-based or an authority-based epistemology that can warp and damage and undermine people's ethics. So I think there's an increased ethical risk from a non-naturalistic epistemology, but it's also more positively, I just think a naturalistic epistemology gives us our best shot of understanding the world. And if we want to make the world better for all sentient beings, then understanding the world is useful. And I think this is probably our best chance, because ultimately, if our beliefs and credences aren't grounded in evidence and reason, if they're not grounded in the reality we all share, in a sense, they're arbitrary. And sometimes that doesn't present a risk. If someone believes astrology is effective, for example, maybe it's just some fun and that probably doesn't cause them, lead them to cause harm. But there are so many other examples where, beliefs that I think are not connected with reality, that are arbitrary, that are ungrounded, can cause even really good, generous, kind-hearted people to do terrible, terrible harms. So that's partly why I think it's useful to have a worldview that combines that epistemological naturalism as well as a sentiocentric compassion, rather than leaving them as completely distinct. And I guess partly my journey into working on this was a bit of a frustration that it seemed like there were two different sorts of movements. There were movements of people who were working on the compassion side, animal advocacy and environmentalism and vegan movements and so on. But quite often those groups seem to be making some catastrophic epistemological errors in their work that undermined their own work, that undermined their cause, that undermined their credibility, and sometimes led to intrahuman ethical problems as well. And then on the other side, you have groups of people who are really focused on a sort of naturalistic epistemology, whether it's philosophically, and groups like secular humanists or atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, rationalists, who are all saying, look, we should really understand the world well using evidence and reason if we want to make it better. But they were overwhelmingly anthropocentric. And I shouldn't ramble on too much because I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but it seemed really weird to me that you could either have, it felt like you could either have epistemological naturalism, but brutal anthropocentrism, or you could have a rich, open-minded, sentiocentric ethic, but often with some really broken, weird epistemology that just didn't seem to work. And I really liked this idea of, like, can't we have the best of both of those worlds integrated into this worldview?
Yeah, that's helpful in understanding. So I mentioned my own sort of educational background. So to point out the obvious, those are all state schools, public schools. But I am at Loyola University New Orleans. I'll just say out loud that it's not only Catholic, but Jesuit specifically. And I've just it's a very small school, but there's a very strong sense of community. And in case you're not aware, that the Jesuit tradition focuses on sort of social solidarity, community building. So there's a lot of really strong social justice advocacy there. And then within the Ignatian tradition, he was informed by St. Francis. So there's actually a stronger commitments, like Pope Francis right now in the latest encyclical stuff, where he's focusing on caring for our common home and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of room for dialogue with people that do see themselves as being informed by faith. But you're right also with the advocacy groups. I'll have probably some more to say about that later, because I've had some alienating experiences of the very sort of dogmatism that I try to avoid in religion, is being sort of present in sort of, you have to think this way if you care about animals, sort of things, that a lot of which I don't necessarily agree with. It's been kind of weird, and I haven't really had a home, as it were, in places that I thought might be a good fit for me. Maybe I'm too much of an intellectual, maybe, I don't know.
That could be it. Just too anti-authoritarian, where, whatever the authority is. And the situation at Loyola is really interesting. And there's so many examples of that, where in a religious worldview, in a religious community, there is so much good there, right? There is the community, there's the connection, there's the caring for each other, there's a sense of universal compassion, there's the golden rule, there's, in the Dharmic religions, there's ahimsa, right? And so, I think it's really important not to throw the baby out of the bathwater. That is wonderful stuff, and we could work together in common cause and help each other and drive forward with that stuff. And absolutely. But the thing that freaks me out sometimes is you can find someone who's deeply invested in those social justice causes because of their, Catholicism, who also thinks that a perfect instantiation of the good will send people to hell because they don't have the right beliefs. Or you can have someone who has a rich ahimsa-grounded compassion for non-human animals, who has a brutal caste-based intrahuman ethics that leads them to think Dalits are untouchable. So, and I'm just left, I like the good bits, right? But and in a way, I'm very open-minded about total freedom of belief, and believe what you like. But at the point where ungrounded beliefs start to be used as justifications for needlessly harming others, that's where I want to draw a pretty clean line, regardless of your supernatural justification, your religious justification, your traditional justification. I'm like, believe what you like if it's astrology or flat earth, but when you're going to start using that to justify harming or discriminating or exploiting others, there's the boundary for me. So we've started touching on already, but I guess the second deep question is those of ethics, and I guess a good place to start is to think about what matters. And obviously that's quite interesting with someone like you and me, who didn't really have that religious toolkit of ethics, right? Because we didn't have divine command theory or a Bible or a Quran or a list of rules or so on. So it'd be interesting again to know your sort of personal journey, even from being a kid, as to, how did you think about right and wrong, good and bad, and the sort of foundations of ethics, if such things exist, and where are you now philosophically on that stuff?
Yeah, maybe I don't know that I thought about it a whole lot. Like growing up, I had a sort of standard sort of suburban white kid, middle class upbringing. So maybe that might speak to certain privileges that I had, that I didn't have to think about certain things because I wasn't a person of color and things like that. But
certain level of comfort and just
right. And not to keep speaking up the virtues of Catholicism, but like, for example, I didn't get any philosophy in high school. I know they get that. So that's one thing that's good. So I wasn't really exposed to these ideas until like what you might call a sort of intellectual awakening in certain ways. I was a bright kid. Like I did advanced placement stuff in high school. So I had college credits, but I didn't really have like a direction. I did not know what I wanted to do. I think I started as an art education major of all things in college, and then a brief stint as a biology major. And then ultimately, after I took a history class, believe it or not, got interested in philosophy, but it was actually, it was called something like History of the Western Tradition. So it wasn't about kings and wars. It was about art and philosophy and like the big ideas. And that kind of really got me there. But yeah, as far as like what grounds my morality, if I could speak to that. So that anti-dogmatism I mentioned earlier kind of informs that as well. Like, I'll just mention, so my first semester in grad school, I took a course called Contemporary Kantian Ethics. That was a so-called pro-level seminar, a 600-level course. The idea was sort of, throw them in the deep end, read a book a week, meet for like 3 hours. And the instructor, philosopher Dennis Arnold, he does like business ethics and Kantian ethics. He kind of gave his own journey when he discovered Kant as an undergraduate. It's just sort of like, like, oh, there's the philosophy. That's right. And he sort of never looked back. And that's always been the weirdest thing to me, because I think philosophy is really good at sort of working at the limits of human understanding, but mostly good at eliminating dead ends and not so much at sort of positively. So, I mean, I'm not a Hegelian, but I really like how he thinks about philosophy sort of only being useful post-mortem, like after, like we follow culture and can diagnose intellectually what's happening, but we're not exactly the most progressive bunch. That's definitely the case, it seems like, when it comes to ethics. So yeah, I just never really got on board with this idea of like being intellectually and personally invested, even like in the sense of my identity, of being grounded in like a particular philosophical system, and especially not a particular ethical system. So it might be worth mentioning, like at the University of Tennessee, I went there because of their strength in applied ethics broadly construed, at least back then. So business ethics, medical ethics, and environmental ethics. I wanted to do all of the above. But applied ethics has generally, as a kind of discipline within philosophy, has tried to remain, at least often, fairly neutral when it comes to moral theory. So like, I'm sure you're familiar with Judith Jarvis Thompson's A Defense of Abortion. She doesn't articulate a moral theory there. She's like, okay, let's go with the viewpoint that those that are opposed to abortion have, and let's look at what the underlying view actually entails and what some problems with that might be. So I tend to think of moral theories as sort of tools for thinking that can be useful, but I'm not really committed to any particular moral philosophy. If I had to pick, I suppose my sympathies are more consequentialist than deontological or virtue theoretical, but I'm definitely not a classical utilitarian in the sense of like Jeremy Bentham. So that's kind of where I come from there. But I think this kind of touches back with some of the stuff you were saying before, that with the methodological naturalism and ethics, I think good ethics does start with what's true, with what's real. So we need empirically backed beliefs. Just one anecdote. So like every spring, like right around now, people rescue deer fawns. Oh, they see like, what they think is an abandoned baby deer off in the woods, and they rescue it, take it into an animal shelter, that kind of thing. But because they think that it needs help and that kind of thing, but actually it's just hidden from predators by its mother. And what we've done is separate the offspring from its mother. So it's morally a terrible thing, but it came from a good place. But the person that was acting wasn't informed by readily available facts that, had they done a little bit of research, would have known. So yeah, sometimes reality is sort of really counterintuitive in that way. Like, think what you will of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, but they've said that, for example, from an animal welfare point of view, dairy is worse than eating meat. I don't know if I'd go that far, but probably dairy is worse than beef, because cattle mostly live on the range until they're taken to the feedlot. So at least cows are treated better under industrial animal agriculture than, say, chickens, but it's obviously much worse with respect to dairy. That's super counterintuitive, I would think. You would think that killing something is worse than taking the milk off of its back, but that doesn't appear to be the case at all. So yeah, there's some interesting ways where I think we need to operate using reality, but I don't have any sort of super important commitments like doctrinaire sort of things. Another one, and this touches more centrally with the animal activists things. So outdoor cats are a pretty big problem, and the more research that's done, the worse the problem looks, not the better. I remember I did an animal ethics fellowship up at Wesleyan University. It was, I think, sponsored by New York University, but in any case, I was at Middleton, Connecticut, at Wesleyan for a summer. This was under the Animals and Society Institute. And that was right around the time, that was like 2012, 2013, when there were those early studies about outdoor cats and just how many birds they're killing. And I was like, wow, it seems like this should matter, and we should stop letting cats outside. I don't have a cat, but yeah, for those that do, this is something that they should really be concerned about. And maybe we need to rethink support for feral cat colonies, not just trap, neuter, and release, but maybe just make them not be a thing anymore to the extent that's possible. But there was so much pushback, just denying the science and just appeals to intuitions because they didn't like where that conclusion was going, but they seemed to not care that the evidence was changing. And that was like very alienating for me. It was like, wait, how can the evidence not matter? So yeah, that was just something that was kind of important to me.
And I think that interaction is fascinating because quite often an ethical stance that someone wants to take then ends up warping their interpretation of the evidence or leads them to ignore it, or, confirmation bias of just selecting pieces of information that support what we want to believe. And it can work the other way around too. So if we're wrong about something and we've been misled, that can lead us into ethical mistakes, and round it goes. And I think often in the most egregious cases, whether it's intrahuman ethics or the way humans treat non-human animals, those two things are tightly wrapped together. And you can see how the broken ethics and the broken epistemology feed off each other and often, drag people down a spiral. So again, that's another, as you say, that's another reason why I think it's important to connect it to both. And it is difficult because the way our, ape brains have evolved, our psychologists, some of my most fascinating conversations have been with psychologists to help us understand how we do these things. It's understandable, but it is also frustrating that people will quite often work backwards. So they'll look at an implication of an implication and go, I don't like that implication. And then they'll rework backwards, reverse engineer in a broken way the ethics and the epistemology to justify the implication that they're already at, rather than having the intellectual honesty and humility and bravery to think through the evidence, think through the ethics, and then just face up to the implications, which may well not be comfortable for you. And it's interesting in the advocacy space because quite often we're challenging others to do that. We're saying, look, face up to, for example, the implications of animal agriculture and the unethic, the horrible treatment that's going on there. You need to work that through and then deal with the implications. But quite often advocacy communities fall foul of that same problem because, as you say, there are certain things that we don't want to face up to either. So
yeah, I have a little bit more to say about like this ape brain thing that you just mentioned. So I've been kind of disturbed by the social sciences in the last couple of like 20 years or so. Like when people are presented with evidence that contravenes their political views, intuitively you would think that would reduce the confidence in those political views. But empirically, the opposite is true, and that's like super disturbing because people will actually, in other words, be more wedded to the views just against the evidence, almost in spite of the evidence, which is just kind of crazy. So maybe that's one thing that's worth talking about is you mentioned our ape brains. So I'm not super doctrinaire with respect to sort of philosophical commitments, but I really do think Darwinism just kind of like as a way of understanding, I guess, informing a worldview of like, where did we come from in a sort of general sense? I think it's actually pretty important in understanding kind of our place in the world with respect to animals, and also how we think and how we fail to think well is also a product of how that came to occur. So yeah, I don't want to suggest like I'm a crass reductionist of morality to science or a sociobiologist or anything like that. But if you look carefully, like Darwin's own views, he had some pretty sensitive and interesting things to say about our moral sympathies and how that's actually quite shared with other animals. I mean, how could it not be? Like the idea that morality could emerge like out of nothing ex nihilo is just kind of wild. But like, what's the line that Darwin said in one of his notebooks? He said something like, origin of man now proved, metaphysics has to flourish. The person who understands a baboon would do more towards metaphysics than Locke. Now, I'm not going to say I fully agree with that, but it's at least provocative and it's in the ballpark of right. So yeah, I do think that understanding human origins, including the origins of morality, including sort of proto-moralities present in maybe at least some currently living non-human animal species, and certainly some earlier hominid species, that's pretty important to understanding what matters and also how we think about what matters, because our brains are a product of that. So what scientists call the environment of our evolutionary adaptedness seems to be really important in ethics. And a lot of philosophers, even contemporary philosophers, don't take this that seriously. And it's just wild to me that we could do substantive moral philosophy completely indifferent of how we got with the structures of thinking that we have. So the intellectual tools that we have, cognitive and affective as well, weren't the sort of like the environments of just a couple hundred people that would have been the case in terms of our evolutionary environment certainly is not developed for the kinds of problems that we face in a world of 8 to 10 billion people, where we've basically hijacked the planet's productivity towards our own interests, and where we're dealing with problems like climate change that have timelines in millennia, not in the next season, and things like that. So yeah, if we understand morality as kind of evolving as a evolutionary tool to deal with conflict resolution within a social species, but mostly dealing with problems that are quite local in both space and time, that can sort of get us to reflect on what might be some of our own shortcomings. Like, we're terrible at math, or what you'd call maths, and that really, like, our statistical reasoning, and how we tend to, think about the crying face in front of us and not the millions of people that might represent. So yeah, I don't put a whole lot of, this might be provocative, but I don't put a whole lot of stock in our pre-reflective moral intuitions, including common sense or everyday morality. Maybe there's something to what Rawls calls reflective equilibrium, where we have considered moral judgments, but those aren't just what we happen to come to the table with and aren't willing to sort of negotiate with. So yeah, I tend to think that common sense morality has a kind of morally problematic preservation of the status quo, and it preserves the sort of recent culture and the powers that be. So it's pretty poorly adapted to dealing with, what I think are some of the most central moral problems of our time, like climate change and biodiversity loss. They're sort of structurally terrible at addressing those.
Agree, yeah. One of the reasons why sometimes people are hesitant about taking that Darwinian approach, in a way, feels like it's a hangover from religious and supernatural thinking, even amongst the naturalistic, right? And there are quite a few of those things where you're like, you have no religious basis to your thinking, you're completely naturalistic, but there's still stuff going on in your head which feels like it's echoes of some religious upbringing or some religious culture. And that partly is this sense that us humans are somehow magically distinct from and raised above and separate from the rest of the natural world, which, just isn't based in fact. I think there's another reason, though, which is that people are very nervous about taking a Darwinian approach to have normative significance, because rightly they see that might lead to, might makes right, or extremely tribal justifications or transactional bases for ethics that I think have the sort of conservative implication that you were talking about, which recognize that, as evolved animals, we're more social than we are truth-seeking, and we're more social than we are universally compassionate. So we've got to be really careful where that leads. But I think you're right that if we want to normatively have a more universally ethical approach, we have to have an accurate understanding of our own evolved proto-ethics. And that means that descriptively, that Darwinian context is deeply important. Everything about us is evolved. And like you say, we didn't invent compassion. We didn't invent even proto-morality. Mothers cared about their offspring for hundreds of millions of years before we even evolved. So yeah, just to echo some of what you said there in that.
Yeah, but there is definitely a sense in which scientists have, thought that reality was a certain way, but they were really projecting what they wanted society to look like. That's definitely been the case, like in the United States, this idea like, Darwinism is about survival of the fittest. So this idea that, Tennyson, nature is red in tooth and claw, and that sort of thing, that therefore justifies ruthless capitalism or something like that. But that's a very selective interpretation of what actually is going on in nature. It tells you more about the kind of outcome that person wants. So a certain kind of dogmatism, where they're then trying to state the world as being objective in this way, when all they're doing is sort of projecting their biases into the natural world. That happens in ecology even, where, do you see nature as being a balance of certain species and the ecosystem as being some kind of integrated whole? Or the population biologists, they tend to emphasize, individual entities and chaos and just sort of energy flow in systems, and not really this idea of integrated wholes. So there's even within ecology a tension between sort of individualists and then sort of holists that see things as being sort of integrated in some more fundamental way. So yeah, I just want to be clear that I don't think Darwinism gets us to like specific moral obligations or anything like that, but I think it's pretty helpful in understanding how we should think about how we think and things like that. And it's very surprising to me how little that's been integrated in philosophy. I know you said you'd mentioned, secular humanism and that sort of thing, where they get rid of the religion part, but they keep the sort of the human supremacism. That's very much alive and well in philosophy as well, where, okay, maybe get rid of the God part, but still, we're obviously different and better than the rest of nature. It's like, wait, what? How does that work exactly? And maybe we are, but that would be the result of reason and argument, not just the presumption that it's always been for at least a couple thousand years in the West.
Yeah. And I want to just give a word of charity to our fellow humanists, because there are more and more people who consider themselves humanist, and even some of the humanist organizations who are working to become less anthropocentric actively now. And what they will say is, they will say, and I think this is right, that the word human in humanism doesn't mean we care about humans. The word human is about our own human morality as agents. We don't need a supernatural morality. Us humans can decide what it means to be good in the world, and that absolutely can include a sentiocentric compassion. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is working within and on humanism to try and push them that direction, because they don't have to be anthropocentric, and hopefully even humanism will shift over time despite the name. But
yeah, I don't know if it's universal to human institutions, but it's definitely a thing in the West where
it's still there. It's still overwhelming.
The Environmental Protection Agency, they deal with environmental problems, damn it. And then you've got the Food and Drug Administration, they deal with food, which obviously has nothing to do with the environment and vice versa. It's like, wait, what? So you have these kind of siloed institutions, and that does also kind of carry over in the activist context, where they're trying to make progress on a sort of non-religious front, but they might not have reflected as much in other ways. So in some ways, feminism was maybe at the forefront there on this focus on intersectionality, because folks like Lori Gruen, who have worked at the intersection of animal advocacy and feminism, because traditional animal rights groups were often sort of deeply sexist, misogynistic even, and also very, very white, like think of the Sierra Club, for example, historically. So there's been a lot of improvement in the last couple of decades there. Is there further room? Yes. To be charitable, that it's improving on that front in I think constructive ways. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that cues up the next part of the deep ethical question: who matters? Because, like you said, you're quite sort of ethically pluralistic in terms of the system. Although if you had to pick one, you'd go for sort of consequentialism of some sort. But it's sort of interesting to ask, well, okay, which are the consequences that matter, and who gets to count in that? So that would be another interesting journey for you to explain, is to, even early on, you were talking about experiences with family, friends, non-human animals, others around you. How did you start to think about who matters and who should be included as we think about moral questions? And then, how have you come to think about that stuff now? Because you've done fascinating work on, sometimes I'll say, look, there's almost these aren't the only ways you can work it out, but there's a sort of menu of moral scope. You can have anthropocentrism, which we were just talking about. You can have my favorite stance, sentiocentrism, that grants moral consideration to all sentient beings. You can go beyond that. Some of the first times the word sentientism was used was actually to criticize it by biocentrists and ecocentrists who were saying, look, you're discriminating against all the non-sentient stuff, the living plants and fungi that probably aren't sentient but are alive. And then the rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, the earth has Gaia that, has a holistic importance in its own right, regardless of sentience. I'd love to know your journey on thinking about moral scope and who gets to count.
So yeah, at least according to what, I think I'm a sentiocentrist or a sentientist when it comes to the question of who matters, but I need to qualify that in a couple of important ways. So I'm a sentientist or a sentiocentrist when it comes to the question of which beings deserve direct moral consideration. So in other words, I think sentience is what matters in determining the question, which beings are moral patients?
Yeah,
there are lots of interests out there. I think that it is literally true that non-sentient living things have interests. I know some, like Peter Singer denies, for example, that plants have interests. I think he's just mistaken about that. But because I think he treated interests as being by definition morally considerable. I don't. I think the plants do have interests, but I don't think they're morally considerable. I could be wrong about that.
Is another difference there that I'm not sure, because I have interviewed Peter actually, which is fascinating. But I also think he is considering interests as a mental phenomenon where, I have a representation of a state I value or disvalue. And if I don't get that thing, I feel something negative. I get it, I feel positive. So that I think he's assuming that an interest has to be related to a mental state. So while he might say, well, yes, that plant has an interest in growing or finding the sun or, reproducing. If it doesn't have a mental state, he wouldn't count that as an interest. Is that a difference, or is it?
Yeah, so I mean, so if by interests we mean only preference interests, so I might make the distinction the following way. So preference interests do require taking an interest in consciously. So I might actually differentiate sentience. So I think sentience isn't just being phenomenally conscious. I think it's phenomenally conscious and some degree of care or concern. In other words, having interests in that psychological sense. So it's what, to put it technically, affective phenomenal consciousness, not just, so I could imagine there being an entity that is conscious, but doesn't have any cares at all in the world. I don't think that being would matter morally, which is maybe a provocative claim, but yeah, if you don't have anything, if you don't care about anything, why should I care about you? So maybe putting it that way, but yeah. So Singer thinks interests are always preference interests, but some of the biocentrists have convinced me that, like Paul Taylor, for example, he doesn't talk about interests because he shares Peter Singer's view that interests are necessarily psychological. So he instead talks about things being good for a being and beings have a good of their own. So I think it's literally true that watering a dry plant, that not a desert plant, but watering a plant that's in need of water is literally good for that plant. In other words, it's in the interest of that plant to be watered. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that the plants are sentient and it's because they're sentient that it's in their interest. No, it's in their interest because it meets an obvious biological need having to do with their species and maybe even individual specific flourishing and their reproductive capacity and things like that. So in other words, what I'm talking about is, so Gary Varner, he's a biocentrist who talks about welfare interests, where not to be confused with welfare from a kind of psychological point of view, but just well-being in terms of the biological flourishing of that organism. So he thinks that all living things have interests, and maybe even some mechanical things as well, if I'm not mistaken.
And it's interesting you mentioned the mechanical, because that's where my brain was going, was to test how far you could push that. Because if it's good for the plant to be watered because of its characteristics as a plant and its typical life cycle structure and the sort of ideal conditions we think it needs because of that, would we say it's good for a ball to roll down a hill when it's at the top? Because it's in the nature of the ball to roll if it's on an incline. And I mean,
so I talk about this a lot in one of my more recent publications in the Journal of Value Inquiry. The paper is Biocentrism Dead. So one thing I noticed is the biocentrists, they want to avoid this thing that, like, this view that every artifact has interests or a good of its own, and therefore, like, you can't see my bicycle in the background, but I need to oil my chain. It is good for my bicycle living in New Orleans to have a well-oiled chain because things rust here. But it's not that the bike has a good of its own. For my interests, I need to do that. So that anything that's good for a bicycle is actually reductive to my goods. So I think so they try to avoid that reductio ad absurdum, that view. That, in other words, the idea that by being committed to the notion that all living things have interests or a good of their own, and therefore matter morally, that therefore all artifacts, insofar as we can talk about, your phone overheating and that being bad for it, that therefore we have obligations to them. They generally want to avoid that because that sounds absurd. And they generally accept that. But one thing I found that's really interesting is when they start to talk about artifacts, they usually will start to point towards sentience as, like, data from Star Trek, that kind of example where you have fully synthetic, human created, or, sentient alien created. I don't know if you want to call them living or not. That's a separate question, but conscious and affective sentient beings. I tend to think that such beings would be morally considerable, but it's because of their sentience, not their artifactuality. That has nothing to do with it. But I think that view is much more problematic. It's hard to hold that line if you are a biocentrist. So maybe to sort of zoom back out, I mean, I think it's a very different thing to say what is good in the world and what we're morally obligated to do. So I do have, I guess, some deontological intuitions there. So maybe to approach it this way, one way of thinking about moral obligation that's very prominent in the last couple of hundred years of moral thinking is, like, how do we overcome egoism? That's the sort of boogeyman. Like, how do you convince someone that they should do anything other than be a Hobbesian and advocate for their self-interest and then sort of extrapolate from there. So how do we move from self-interest to regard for others? So one way to think about that is like, well, what is it about me that matters? Like what things about my nature, what properties, what capacities can I remove and still think that I matter from a moral point of view? Like, so some people say, oh, every individual has fingerprints, right? You hear some pro-life people say that, oh, however many weeks of gestational development, there's a heart or fingerprints. And I'm like, wait, so do you mean that people that are born without fingers or have lost them, therefore don't matter morally? A lot of these ideas don't stand up to a moment's reflection. But I think sentience really does. Like if I can imagine myself in a persistent vegetative state, I literally don't care what would happen to me anymore. So in other words, when we're reduced to merely biological life, now maybe some important things need to be said about potential life. Like, I don't want to say that all abortions for any reason are morally permissible or that some versions of infanticide are okay. I don't want to touch that right now, but just the point is that as we're thinking about how to go beyond self-interest, that's just one way of thinking about ethics. I think something like sentience seems to be the right answer. Merely being alive does not, merely being conscious does not. So I think that's basically the right answer. So when Bentham said, the relevant question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? I think that's pretty much on the right track. Now, the way biocentrists tend to think about things is from a more sort of like, what is there that's good in the world? Ethics is about fostering that in some sense. So there's something more like a receptivity to the good and a kind of hidden assumption that what we ought to do is bring about the most goodness in the world. So that's a kind of way of doing ethics that starts from a very different idea of who your opposition is, if that makes sense. But I'm not so sure that's like, I'm not on board from that from the get-go, because I just don't know that it's true. I'm not convinced that it's true that we should just, that we're implicated in producing maximum goodness in that way of understanding things. So maybe that does
it also strikes me, and this is part of my concern, I think, with biocentrism and ecocentrism, because I think there is a good faith way to hold those stances, which genuinely is an extension of ethical consideration. There is also what I would do, which is to extend that consideration in an instrumental way, but not in an intrinsic way, because I do think there's a radical difference between putting a knife into a pig and putting a knife into a tree, right? I think that's a reasonably clear dividing line. But it strikes me that at least in common discourse, a lot of biocentrism and ecocentrism, as you said, it's saying, well, let's take this broader conception of what the good is. But it's rarely examined who is getting to define good. And of course, it's powerful humans, right? So it quite often ends up being just a reflection of the value structure of powerful anthropocentric humans. So the reason we care about the environment is because I want comfortable temperatures, I want clean water, I want nature to be pretty so I can enjoy a walk in the woods, and I want a range of ecosystem services. That's really what's underlying it. It's not actually a genuine good faith, holistic moral consideration for others. That may be slightly cynical, but I'm just worried about who imputes the good there, because when people talk about that river should be clean and reach the sea, that interest is in the head of the human who's saying it. It's not a characteristic of the river in that. There's a difference there to me.
Yeah, and I will say there's some variability amongst the biocentrists there. Like maybe I'll put my cards on. I think classic rock is better than modern rock, and I'll just say that like Paul Taylor, he's the earliest biocentrist within the environmental ethics literature. I actually think he has the best version of that view, and that each subsequent version, like Gary Varner and Nicholas Agar, I think they're actually progressively worse in that respect. So like, I know, just to be clear, Gary Varner, to be charitable, he no longer holds this view. He's now a sentientist, not a biocentrist. He realized the error of his thinking there, but at least at the time that he wrote his book, In Nature's Interest, he thought that we should start from trying to explain our interests. So back to this notion of interests, pretty clearly, people that smoke like smoking. They have an interest in smoking from a psychological point of view, but it's also a case that smoking is bad for them from a kind of welfare interest point of view. So he tries to basically develop his theory out of accounting for human interests ultimately, but he thinks that thought that the most plausible way to do so would actually require attributing interests in a morally significant way to non-conscious entities. Paul Taylor, he calls his view the biocentric outlook on nature. He quite notoriously denies human supremacy. He thinks that, so he's quite good about that, he thinks that the things that we think are most important for us. And we, of course, prize consciousness and rationality because we're really good at it, but it doesn't matter at all to a banana. And from the point of view of a banana, insofar as it makes sense to talk about the point of view of a banana, consciousness doesn't matter at all, and would actively be bad because it would just require a bunch of energy for those neurons that literally wouldn't do anything. So yeah, I think that's just kind of an interesting aspect of all that. And I will point out a corollary is that some have criticized sentientism or sentiocentrism as being ultimately anthropocentric, because we're starting from something that we think is important about us and then saying, okay, maybe it's not humanness specifically, but consciousness or the capacity to feel or something like that. And then we extend in that way, but that's not objective enough, that it doesn't move far enough beyond a human point of view. I'd have more to say about that.
I do think that's an important challenge, and I've had some fascinating conversations with people along those lines. People like Josh Geller's a previous guest who's done work on environmental law and AI law and animal ethics and how those things fit together. And he prefers a sort of more hybrid approach that includes a sort of relational stance that isn't focused on the characteristic of sentience, because he's nervous of that. And I think it is a valid challenge, because us humans are great at doing that, right? We're great at dreaming up some new scheme that happens to center us, and sentience can do that. But at the same time, I do think sentientism and sentiocentrism is explicitly anti-anthropocentric on the basis that there are maybe a quadrillion, quintillion sentient beings alive today, and us humans are a vanishingly tiny number of them. So in that sense, even in the current moment, we are decentering the human and recognizing the vast swathes of sentient beings, and sentience existed for hundreds of millions of years before we even evolved. So in that sense, it can't be an anthropocentric characteristic. It is more, and again, I don't even think you don't even have to think of it as a characteristic. You can think of it as the capacity for an entity to value things, anything. And if an entity can value things, its own experiences, its own life course, then that is the moral imperative for us to also care, because they do. And you can describe that even without mentioning the word sentience. So
yeah, and I think there might even be some anthropocentrism in that allegation of anthropocentrism, because they're assuming that because it's something humans have, that therefore we're saying it's ours, and therefore animals have it, and therefore they're like us. But what you're saying is that's completely inverted, right? Sentience is much more broad than us, existed before us. Well, assuming we go extinct before other sentient beings, will outlast us, and so on. So yeah, I think that objection sort of to just because we have a capacity doesn't mean that it's our capacity. That's not anthropomorphism. That's just accepting a part of reality, a certain kind of capacity that's out there.
And that's partly why I think sentientism and sentiocentrism is a powerful bulwark against anthropocentrism, because anthropocentrism seems to leak back into so many other schemes of human thought. So the ecocentrists and the biocentrists will often exclude, for example, non-human sentient wild animals and non-human farmed animals and lab animals from their moral consideration, even as they're caring about rocks and rivers and trees and ecosystems, which again belies the anthropocentrism that's leaked in. And even some of the relational ethics schemes, which are brought in to try and be even more generous and broad in connecting us with nature or with artificial intelligences or other things that may not be sentient. They're seen as being more progressive than sentientism. Again, risk that anthropocentrism, because guess who gets to define the nature of those relations? It's us, right? And if I define my relationship with you as I'm the farmer and you're the farmed animal, woe betide you, right? So there's always a risk that us humans will find some way of recentering ourselves. And I think sentientism and sentiocentrism is a powerful bulwark to reset that and stop us doing it.
Some of the biocentrists and the ecocentrists, I think, have said some just really problematic things there that sort of reflect not just anthropocentrism, but a certain male-centered point of view. So, like, for example, just a couple of ideas there, like this, like domesticated animals, they were, wild organisms capable of, eking it out on their own. So there's a kind of presumption that something like self-sufficiency, like each person is an island unto themselves kind of a thing that sort of suggests that as a model, but that doesn't really work if you look to like disability studies and some of the things the feminists have said that, well, wait, that's not true of any of us, really. If you think about it, that we're actually a lot more community connected and dependent on others in ways that we need to remind ourselves of, probably. So yeah, there's simultaneously the denial on the part of domesticated animals that they're no longer self-sufficient and therefore not morally considerable, that we've turned them into artifacts and therefore what happens to them doesn't matter. But then also it sort of presumes a bit about us that isn't actually true when we're talking about human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I wanted to sort of turn back to that you mentioned earlier was this. Sorry, when you say intrinsic value, that gets my gears turning. One thing I kind of want to talk a little bit about here is, in some ways, I think the animal ethics and just philosophy there has perhaps been overly narrowly construed, like the whole fight between sort of animal rights theorists and then like environmental ethicists, whatever that turns out to mean. There's some similar problems there for like, what does it mean to be a sentientist? Like, does that explicitly exclude religion and that kind of thing? Like, if you're an environmental ethicist, do you have to believe that environmental wholes exist and are morally valuable? I think both of those are false, as it turns out. Does that mean I can't be an environmental ethicist? That's like, do I have to have that belief to be on this team? So again, the anti-dogmatism part's been prominent there for me. But like, if you think to Peter Singer and Tom Regan, so Peter Singer is a dyed-in-the-wool utilitarian. Tom Regan was obviously influenced by Singer, but has a kind of rights theoretical or deontological point of view. But it's worth pointing out they were sort of both trained in the analytic tradition, so they have fairly austere conceptions about the nature of moral value. And also, in some respects, I mean, they wrote in like the 1970s and 80s, at least their early work. So that wasn't that long after moral philosophy was more or less a wasteland in the Anglo-American tradition. If you think, early 20th century, that's when you had like logical positivism and emotivism. People weren't really doing that much substantive moral philosophy. They were like intuitionists and things like that. But in general, analytic moral philosophy was kind of coming into its own in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, with like John Rawls kind of reclaiming a positive space for thinking about democracy as not just being a pet theory of the West, but maybe something that's actually worth pursuing in its own. So, a sort of philosophical defense of liberalism broadly construed. So I think there's certain dogmatisms that might have limited Singer's utilitarianism and Reagan's deontology there, especially with what they have to say about wild animals, because I think they're mostly their main focus was on, oh man, we're doing some really terrible things to domesticated animals, so let's develop a theory. Oh, and then what about almost all of the animals, which is to say wild animals? Well, let's think about that through the lens that we've developed to address this practical problem that has to do with animal exploitation, largely in the domestic context. But they have some very little to say, and what little they do have to say, so I think just deeply problematic and poorly articulated. Like, have you ever heard of Elliot Sober's N+M problem? So the basic idea is this: like, suppose that you have, I'm paraphrasing here, but N+M means, suppose you have a total of 100 sentient units. So like 100 domestic pigs, let's say. Now, suppose that's where N is 100. But what if N and M are different? In other words, this is the biodiversity problem. What if you've got 50 pigs and then 50 whales? All else equal, is that better than the world in which there are 100 pigs? According to Singer and Regan, the answer seems to be they are morally equivalent. There is no moral difference. So they explicitly say that things like rarity don't hold any moral value whatsoever, that Regan is quite like the last rhinoceros deserves no more protection than the billionth pig that is currently domesticated, or whatever that number turns out to be, which is in some sense true, right? Like, in the sense that, like, I don't think that the last member of a dying indigenous language group has more human rights than I do from a particular way of thinking. But from another point of thinking, of course, that deserves more protection than you or me, but not that they have more rights, right? So I think that we need to think a lot more about that area. That's one of the areas I've been thinking a lot more. You mentioned intrinsic value. Like, I do think that it's true that I don't think that value is out there in the world to be discovered, like a lot of environmental ethicists think. Like, Holmes Ralston III, his view is that there's value sort of everywhere you look in nature that exists completely independently of psychological capacities at all. So if there were no sentient beings, he still thinks the world would be full of value. I'm not sure what I think about that view.
So does he think the same of Venus or Mars or the planets around Alpha Centauri, or assuming there's no sentient beings there or being impacted by them? Because this is a conversation I often have with ecocentrism. I'm saying, look, if you're concern about an ecosystem broadly defined is independent of the perspectives of sentient beings, all of those other lifeless planets also matter in some sense.
Well, at least in the case of Ralston, he thinks life is important. So he thinks that, he's a pluralist with respect to non-anthropocentric values. He thinks every living thing is valuable. He thinks sentience is valuable. He thinks there's value in diversity. He thinks there's value in relationships within ecosystems. So he basically sees value everywhere he looks. So he would, but I don't think he's committed to the view that the existence of Venus as such is valuable. But if Venus had life, then it would be. So I think there's something like that going on in his view. But yeah, I would make the distinction at least between if we think of the distinction between sort of intrinsic and instrumental, that's the sort of standard definition. But really the distinction is intrinsic and extrinsic, something that has value sort of in itself or something that has value from outside in some sense. So I tend to think of that as sort of intrinsic value, like value which inheres in the entity itself, or intrinsic valuing, which is a kind of loose way of talking about intrinsic value, where an entity that values a thing in a non-instrumental way. So technically, intrinsic valuing is an extrinsic, non-instrumental value. So things like beauty, knowledge, and those sorts of things, I think the natural world is quite full of, and it's very, very important, not just instrumentally. I don't mean to discount the importance of instrumental value, but I think there's quite a lot of intrinsic value in nature, properly understood, but not in the way that a lot of environmental ethicists think about it. And I think that maybe in some respects, the conflict between animal ethicists and environmental ethicists is one of the sort of false early points of agreement in the literature that still needs to be worked out, but that's just not right at all.
Work in progress, yeah. So maybe to wrap up this Who Matters section, because I think we're both roughly in this, sentiocentric space. I guess one of the things I've tried to suggest is that I'm much more worried about sentient beings being excluded from our moral consideration than I am about people wanting to go further. So I'm quite open-minded about if people want to go into biocentrism or ecocentrism or some of these wider moral scopes, as long as every sentient being gets serious moral consideration. And I guess I'm also quite keen to make sure that when we talk about moral consideration, moral status or compassion, that is actually meaningful, because quite often people will claim they care, but act in a way that doesn't even reach a minimally demanding baseline of obligation. And I guess partly what I suggest as that minimally demanding baseline, I don't know if you think this works, is basically a non-maleficence, basically saying that if you get moral consideration as a sentient being, that should mean at minimum that we wouldn't needlessly, harm, exploit, or kill you. Now, of course, needlessly is doing a lot of work there, as it always does. But at least as a baseline to say, even if there aren't obligations to help or to assist or to go out of our way or to sacrifice ourselves, is that at least a minimal moral baseline we could draw to maintain the meaning of moral consideration? But
yeah, so I mean, one thing to think about is as we expand the class of entities which are morally considerable, we just by definition create more beings that we have to think about. So let me start by endorsing anthropocentrism in a very qualified way, right? Which is exactly this way. I'm a moral agent. A plant is not. So ultimately, when I'm being asked to take something's interests or well-being into account, that's making demands on me that isn't necessarily reciprocal. And as we expand the sphere of moral obligation, there's the worry that it cheapens it, right? So with biocentrism, especially, if everything's valuable, then nothing is, right? Like in some sense, like
it's like an ethical flattening almost, yeah.
Yeah, like for example, if something like the following is true, there are more cells inside my body that don't have my genome than do, like E. coli in my gut and all these other sorts of things. if it's true that every living thing is morally considerable, then every bacterium is morally considerable. So I just don't really know what to do with that from a practical moral point of view. So I don't want to say that this is the reason that I'm a sentientist, but it is at least somewhat selective with the entities to which it describes moral consideration. I don't know that Dale Jamieson, he's a philosopher at NYU. I don't know if he's put this in print anywhere, but I've chatted with Dale a bit, and he said something along the lines of, if insects are sentient, then all bets are off with respect to what his moral view actually is. So he's been a lifelong vegetarian and defended something like sentientism for at least as long as I've been alive, I want to say. But if there are so many insects that even if it's just within a sentientist point of view, he's not obviously a sentientist if it turns out that all insects are sentient. Now, I'm not going to say that that's my view, but if every living thing matters, like, does that mean I need to change my diet? Not in terms of what I eat, but how that impacts my intestinal flora and fauna. That's just an intuitively implausible way of thinking about things. So this is the anthropocentrism, is that ultimately ethics is making demands on the limits of the behavior of moral agents. I've got a finite life and a lot of things that I'm interested in. So things have to there has to be an adequate reason for me to take a being's interests into account. And I think that flattening of the moral universe ends up cheapening obligation to such an incredible degree that I just don't find that views plausible at the end of the day. And I'm open to new evidence and arguments, because I've walked through the arguments for ecocentrism and biocentrism. And part of me sort of wants there to be a there, but I'm not sure that there is.
And that's partly why I tend to focus on this minimally demanding sort of non-maleficence as a baseline obligation. And maybe it's just a cop-out, because on the insect question, for example, if you're a strict utilitarian, you actually have to shift your priority and your focus to, concentrate on the utility of those many quadrillions of insects. Whereas if your obligation is one of, non-maleficence and just trying to do what we can not to cause harm, it still leaves quite a lot of space for prioritization and choices and open. But whether it's just a cop-out or not, I don't know. But I agree that there's a risk of the sort of ecocentric holistic approach of, an ethical flattening. And again, it's another way the anthropocentrism can leak back in, because I've had many conversations, not with academics, but with, just members of the public who will say, I go beyond you. I care richly about the entire environment, and we are all part of interconnected, richly related ecosystems. Those relationships matter as part of those cycles that have gone on for millennia. Life consumes life. Now I'm going to have a Big Mac, right? And
yeah,
I see what you've done there. That was brilliant. Well done. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's like this merely intellectual point that has like no actual impact on their behavior.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, there's something unusual going on there. Yeah, it's very convenient.
But the final question, and this is a really easy one: how do we make a better future? Now, you can have sort of grand utopian visions, but I'd also be really interested in what role you think philosophy and public philosophy and ethics can play in actually practically moving us forward positively, both in your research work or your practical ethics, your work with the Ethics Bowl and so on. So go wherever you like with that crazily big question. But given we sort of share roughly a naturalistic understanding of this world we all share, we share roughly this sort of sentiocentric care. How do we try and make it better?
Yeah, well, so this is going to sound weird, but I have an increasingly dim view about the role of philosophy in achieving effective change, at least sort of, let me qualify that in certain ways, but I just mean that in the sense that, like, I don't think that people are they don't choose their beliefs based on reason and argument for the most part. That can play a role in their thinking, but I don't think it's primary. Now it's not universally true, and some people are more reasons receptive than others, and people that have philosophical training, even a small amount, like taking a college class or something like that, are of course going to be, I suspect, more receptive to that kind of thing. But this might be weird, but I'm not sure that, yeah, at least philosophy as practiced by contemporary philosophers, like, I'm not sure if you've read any of my stuff, but that's not exactly that accessible for, someone that doesn't have an advanced degree in philosophy or something like that. But I do think it can be part of, like I kind of mentioned, that sort of Hegelian sort of retrospective understanding of how worldviews work and what the sort of reasons are for them and things like that. But I'll focus more on the sort of utopian vision part and circle back to the sort of cynicism about the role of philosophy. So one thing that really impacted me was reading the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organizations, their white paper, Livestock's Long Shadow. Are you familiar with that piece?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things where like you read it and you're just like, that can't be true. Except if you read through it, it's like, wow, that's just crazy. Because when you tell people, they're like, oh, it can't be true that livestock is like the central aspect or a central aspect to all leading environmental problems. But basically it is. I mean, at a fundamental way, we've hijacked the planet to raise food, to feed to domestic animals, to feed to ourselves. So we've sort of harnessed the power of the sun in the most incredibly inefficient way possible to feed ourselves, which kind of makes sense given what our species was evolutionarily used to eating within our relatively recent history and things like that. But yeah, we've profoundly impacted ourselves and the planet in a relatively short period of time, just the last couple tens of thousands of years in terms of domesticating animals.
And if that system didn't exist today and you proposed it, people would think you were totally nuts. Like you say, land use, water use, feed conversion ratios, 95% waste, emissions, pollution. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, so like at a high level, like the things I think are important. So I haven't really talked about the Peace Corps stuff, but sustainable human development is a huge thing. Addressing climate change is number two, and stemming biodiversity loss. So those are, those were two negatives, but I actually think in some ways they're positives. But addressing climate change and combating biodiversity loss are the big ones. So globally, we need to grapple with those, including coming to terms with novel ecosystems. But by novel ecosystem, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but it's just novel in the sense where some of the species that are in that ecosystem are there as a consequence of human activity. In other words, invasive and or non-native, depending on how you make that distinction, because now the overwhelming majority of ecosystems on our planet are no longer natural in that sense. They include species that don't belong there in terms of their historicity and things like that. So I think we need to sort of grapple with the degree to which we've already changed ecosystems and experiment in fixing that, and also maybe dealing with ecosystems perhaps in ways that are managerial, but maybe in more humane ways. So in the West, just sort of really high level stuff like ending at least exploitative industrial animal agriculture. We haven't really talked about vegetarianism and moral obligation and that sort of thing, but moving to mostly meatless diets, because I think that can be off-putting if you're trying to convince people for positive change that the absolutism of vegetarianism can be too much, or at least too much in a first conversation, when less meatless Monday is probably not enough, but maybe meat Mondays and then no meat the rest of the days, but just getting us to reduce our dependency on livestock would just do an awful lot for improving the welfare of animals, for the welfare of human beings, and the welfare of the diversity of life insofar as there's a welfare there. So yeah, and I'll point out that the trend is sort of towards our species as increasingly an urban species. We're not equally distributed across the planet, even within countries. So we have to think a lot more carefully about how we design urban spaces, how those intersect with natural places. But I think it's definitely possible with even a population as high as 10 billion, although I'd prefer a lower number, that we could give back something like half the planet or more to rewilding efforts and that sort of thing. But that's only possible if we either move beyond meat in the way that we currently do it, or move beyond it altogether. Like let's not bog us down in, in vitro meat discussions and that sort of thing, but there might be ways to do it in that way. But at least raising livestock to feed grain, to feed ourselves, that seems to be like the lowest hanging fruit of things that we should fix, that would have positive impacts for humans, animals, and the rest of nature.
And one of my previous guests, Troy Vertese, has written a book called Half Earth Socialism, which includes that land story about, and I think that land use picture is one of the things I wish people understood. There's land use, but there's also feed conversion ratios to really get their heads around the scale of the agricultural problem there. And it's worth layering in the ethics again, because my sentientism has led me personally to go beyond vegetarianism to veganism, because even in non-factory, non-intensive farming, I see that core exploitation and usage, and ultimately the slaughterhouses where all those animals end up, is as directly contravening even that minimally demanding non-maleficence ask. I think I just don't think there's any way of doing that at all in an ethical way. So, and I'm keen to hold on to that clarity. At the same time, because of my compassion for the victims of those systems, I'm quite open-minded about, tactics and messaging and what will work with consumers and incremental steps. I guess I'm worried, and many others are worried too, that those incremental steps become a means of helping those industries perpetuate, because again, we know what us humans are like, right? So if we can feed seaweed to cows, or we can do meatless Mondays, or we can, tweak these systems here or there, it gives us an excuse to never take that step back and look at these systems from the perspective of the victims, the sentient victims of those systems, and achieve some sort of ethical clarity, which, to be honest, we might need, because if we're really going to drive the level of change. So I just wanted to sort of layer that sort of ethical clarity that I'm keen to keep hold of on top of the problem.
We're running together some issues, right? So there's like the conscience raising of people, and then there's like systems change, which I don't think ordinary people have a whole lot to do with, frankly. Although if you can get enough people to change their moral, so what you're talking about, like veganism as a kind of moral ideal, but then being pragmatic in certain ways with respect to how you sort of market that with respect to everyday folk or that sort of thing. But yeah, given the degree to which representative democracy, so I'm in the United States, I've never really experienced true representative democracy, at least not in my lifetime. It sounds nice. We should try it sometime. But
yeah, we have first past the post here in the UK. So
yeah, that sort of yeah, exactly, same problem. So yeah, there's a lot to be said there. But reforming systems, it is clearly true that, I mean, political reform and economic reform, and the intersection of those two is really important, and moneyed interests play too large a role. Yeah, that's definitely the case. Yeah, part of my positive vision, I guess that was more the pragmatic step, but yeah, a positive vision. So I don't think I'm committed to the view that vegetarianism is morally obligatory for every human person, or maybe even just for you and I. I think it's a morally good thing, and maybe even a moral ideal. But given where most people are, I'm not sure that that's a realistic expectation. Maybe, again, I might have some weird views about the nature of moral obligation. So are we really committed to the view that almost everyone is acting in a very seriously morally wrong way multiple times a day? There's a worry that view, given what most people have in terms of their informational basis, that's might be a little bit of an elitist way of thinking about things. So maybe I'm more of a pragmatist here than you are. But if we can reduce the harm, so maybe an emphasis on harm reduction, maybe that's my consequentialism shining through here a little bit. But yeah, so reduced meat consumption. And let me just put it this way. I'm definitely more confident that inflicting suffering on an animal is morally bad than I am that animal death is morally bad. Now that varies a lot, probably by species. As you get towards the more highly sentient species like chimpanzees, I think they do have a sense of self and future. They pass the mirror test and things like that. And then, if at least as a conceptual construct, a minimally sentient being, whatever that turns out to be biologically, I very strongly doubt that they have interests that matter with respect to their continued life. Just the experience of pleasure and the avoidance of pain seem to matter. So at least, like, as a sort of conceptual possibility, the idea that we could raise animals in a way that is conducive to their welfare and then their deaths. So this would not work, for example, with USDA slaughterhouses that require very problematic transport, for example. But, some of the sort of traditional local farming, that sort of thing, I'm at least not willing to pass the kind of judgment on that I am the sort of animal industrial complex, if you will. But I do think as an ideal, something like vegetarianism, probably even veganism, seems right. Like, maybe to put it this way, in 1,000 years when we all live on spaceships, I like to think that we'll look back on the period in time in which we raised and killed animal bodies for our sustenance as being a totally archaic, impermissible way of looking at things, but that's not the world that we live in right now.
And I get that, and I want to be pragmatic too. I'm just nervous about the pragmatism leaking into the ethics. And I think you can look back at some of the intrahuman social justice causes of the past and see that people tried to do the same thing too. And sometimes you just did need to recognize that enslavement of other people, regardless of how nicely you treated them, was just wrong. And we just need to stop it. And actually, it was easier than you thought it was going to be too, because there was, there were obviously better ways of doing it. And I suspect that might be true here, because when we switch to take the perspective of the other, and we recognize that in an evolutionary context, and I had a good conversation with Peter Singer about this, that the interest in continuing to live is probably deeply ancient in biological terms, and therefore very broadly distributed across the animal kingdom, maybe even more broadly distributed than an interest in not suffering. I get very nervous about concepts of theoretical versions of animal agriculture that are suffering free, partly because they do not exist anywhere in the world today at all. So in a sense, it's not relevant to the ethics of today's animal agriculture, but also because it just opens a door for people to carry on doing what we're doing and not really changing. So it is a tricky thing, because I recognize the need for pragmatism, but at the same time, I don't want to lose that imagining what it's like to be the dairy cow perspective, having their calf taken away, right?
Yeah, that seems really important.
We're so tempted, it's so tempting to find ways of dodging that. And I guess the other thing I'd say is part of the reason this, people think of veganism, for example, as extreme or not pragmatic, is because we keep telling ourselves that's the truth. So the reason it's socially difficult is because we keep saying it's socially difficult. And it is one of those weird situations where the technical, and I think this is true in places like renewable energy as well, where the technology and the solution is actually there at scale already. What we really just need is a psychological shift and the political will to make the change. And if we just decide to do that, the technology and the practicality is there and easy and straightforward and nutritional and delicious. So I'm nervous that we just get trapped by the pragmatism into losing the mission and losing the ethical perspective of the other.
We tend to think that the way things are is the way things they've, or the way things are and the way things they've recently been is the way things always have been and always must be. And it's so difficult to change, and it takes a really long time. And
again, it's an intrinsically conservative mindset, which I understand, right? And yeah,
but yeah, I suppose as a consequentialist, there's a sort of a couple different ways of thinking about it. Wait, am I identifying as a consequentialist now? So at least when I put on my consequentialist hat, I'll say something like, yeah, like eating meat that was already purchased and no one else seeing you do it. Okay, that actually doesn't matter at all, right? Like it'll go to waste. If anything, there might be a moral reason to eat it, because I mean, there's at least an argument there. But then if you think about something like practical reform at our level, or like these really deep structural changes, those probably don't need to happen all that often, but they probably do need to happen for important reasons when they improve the welfare. So yeah, another, like maybe just to give an example that I kind of wanted to mention anyways, because you're talking about my vision for the future. The United States, and to a lesser degree in Europe and now across the world, we've developed a car-centric culture that's now baked into urban design. And I just aesthetically and otherwise, I just don't like cars. I think they're a blight on the planet. And the amount of space and resources that we've given to them without a whole lot of thought, and with taxpayer dollars in the United States, like after World War II, with the whole development of the interstate system, now as we're switching to electric vehicles to combat climate change, we didn't think about that particular move very well. Like, why did we still assume that the personal automobile is the way to electrify moving bodies and goods around the world? So I think that's just a mistake. And because you wanted me to talk a little bit about like in the developing world. So like electric scooters and bicycles, like I'm an avid cyclist, I don't have an e-bike, but they're definitely happening. Part of that's due to just how expensive electric personal cars are. I don't know if you saw the news, but Biden plans to impose a 100% tariff on imported Chinese electric vehicles. Like, screw the middle class and the poor. You've got to buy a $60,000 Tesla to be in this sort of electric game. That's pretty, like, that's...
But it'll be made in America. Yeah.
But it'd be made in America. Yeah, that's just a sort of unusual negative turn, if you ask me. But this... I think we need to, as we work towards urbanizing our species, that probably means significantly removing cars from the equation too, electrified or not. They're just such an inefficient use of space and resources. I just don't see how we can have a sustainable future absent some kind of infinite supply of energy or something like that. So that fits with a broader thing about livable, walkable cities and things like that, and getting us to wild places using public transportation, not, weekend warriors driving Subarus and that kind of thing. That's not a model for the future.
And I think that's another example where, again, I think just given some of the imperatives we're facing, we need some more radical thinking, right? Tweaks won't do it. And to your earlier point, there are moneyed interests and there's the inertia of social norms and culture and enormous corporate and governmental interests that are driving forward an inertia and a conservatism about so many of these different industries, whether it's the tobacco industry, whether it's big oil, whether it's animal agriculture, whether it's, the car industries, right? And all of those interests just want to tweak things a little bit so we can keep doing what we're doing. And I think in all of those spaces, we're going to be forced into a more radical approach that maybe will bring your sort of 1,000-year timeline into 20 or 30 years. And I don't know, we'll see. But I agree, right? We've got to cut through these things and not just be tempted into minimal tweaks, because I don't think they're going to be enough, either ethically or environmentally.
Because there are kind of two schools of thought there, right? There's like, oh, there's this problem, so we have to fix the way that thing happens so that it's not a problem, but not actually change our behavior at all, right? So if you switch from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, you've made the switch, but you haven't actually given up anything. There's no sacrifice. So I've noticed, like, amongst animal activists and environmentalists, there's often this idea of like, it's personal sacrifice and that sort of thing that's the model. But then you've got some people within those camps that, no, it's about this sort of structural change, that what we need is like headless chickens and that sort of stuff, and just keep animal agriculture as it is, just eliminate the suffering, but you can still have meat every meal or something like that. It's just fascinating to me that people do kind of sort into those.
Yeah. And then there's other people like me who are saying plants are edible.
Yeah.
And because I agree, I think there's a risk about the first of those camps, because again, that virtue transformation is more about humans. It's not about the consequences to the victims, right? So I'm nervous about that, but we need to be virtuous thing. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the consequences for the victims, right? So I think you're right. There's a danger there.
The virtue signaling, right? Like, I forget, it was a long time ago, but the study was like, I'm a Prius owner, so I can say this, right? When people were polled, like, why do you own a Prius? Concern for the environment was a major reason, but a higher reason than that was the appearance of concern for the environment, or people that make a lot of sacrifices in terms of like their individual consumptive behaviors, but then they still fly on airplanes. That more than compensates for what sacrifices they made. And they'd literally have less impact if they were just simply poor, rather than making all these sacrifices and that sort of thing. But with respect to meat eating, yeah, I think a lot of that's just sort of probably our food preferences are formed so early in life. And we have, this idea of comfort foods. Like, I did my dissertation under John Nolt and his partner, Annette Mendela. She's a medical ethicist. She's been a vegetarian for a long time, but she would still have she had an Italian grandmother that she would once a year eat meat with, because that was just, part of the tradition. So there's something to be said for, I don't know, certain preserving those kinds of traditions. But if you look at something like, India, there's like 1 billion people, 40% of which approximately are vegetarian. In other words, the number of vegetarians in India is greater than the population of the United States. It's absolutely possible and actual to have large-scale societies that exist independently of meat. And it's probably a lot easier to achieve than we tend to think, but there are these systems that profit off of the way things are that make that hard to achieve. So I do think you're right that there's something to be said about vegetarianism or veganism as a sort of, there's a clarity and simplicity there that people can see, oh, this is a thing that can happen, that these people I know and respect actually live. They walk that walk, that probably isn't as effective as like do better, but still do the thing that's morally problematic. So yeah.
And I think one of the things that can sometimes help is to, because I'm not sure a relentless focus on individual consumption decisions is always that helpful. It can be with some people at some times, but maybe it's more about focusing on the ethics of the systems and the practices that are done in those situations, because then I think you can distract yourself, step back from that as an individual consumer, look at the processes that are going on, whether it's a different industry or energy or deforestation or the meat, dairy, and egg industries. And you can sort of just look at the practices in those industries, what is being done to the sentient beings within them, and form an ethical view of that independently. And then you can sort of come back to the consumption decisions and the subsidies and the politics and the influence and so on. Sometimes that's a better way of resolving it than starting with the consumption decision, because it's, it's more of a virtue thing. But
philosophers, at least early on, right, like Singer and Regan, they sort of start from the moral paradigm is how ought I live my life? That's the sort of relevant question. And that might not be the central question in this. So I do have analytic training, but I'm that's like my area, but I am sympathetic with like some, critical theorists point that like, no, it's really these systems, these structures, and we need to think sort of more about like collective action, not individual behavior, and emphasizing the structural problems and not, or at least primarily, right? And then think about how individual behavior fits into that. But the central point be about the systems themselves. So in some ways, I think the way that Singer Regan pitched that was not quite maybe the most effective way of achieving the kind of change that they desired.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because when you dig under Singer and Regan, the reason why they think I as an individual should act a certain way is because of the interests of the other. And actually, that's something that the critical theorists and the feminist care theorists and, and the relational people go back to, because the thing that's in common is it's not what I do that is the grounding of ethics. It's what does that sentient being want to do? What's in their interest, and that, regardless of your ethical system, is the thing that should ground what then becomes right for us to do. But you start from the perspective of the other and genuine attempt to try and understand their interests and their values and their aspirations, and then morality is about acting with that seriously in mind, I think. But so in a way, there is a sort of link behind all of these different ethical theories that is about recognizing the perspective of the other, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the part of feminist ethics that's really important in informing thinking about animals. But it's not that we need to talk to women and ask them, but rather in this case, more look to the biology and our common sense understanding of what animals want, but truly pay attention and listen and be informed by the science there. That seems to be really important. And that's not about us at all. That's about following the evidence, sort of circle back to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. You've closed the loop perfectly with our epistemology. Okay. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? But also, how can people read your books, follow your academic work? I know you're not a big social media fan. You're a wiser man than me.
I mean, I used to do Facebook and Instagram back when Instagram was like an artsy platform where I would share my photography. But now I don't even know what it is. I haven't been on there in a long time. But I'm not on any of the major social media sites, or at least I don't use them. So maybe I need to do a little bit better about self-marketing and branding. I used to have a personal website and bring that back. But yeah, if folks want to follow my work, probably the best way to do so now is tracking my publications at Phil People, which is so philpeople.org/profiles/Joel-MacClellan, MacClellan. So anything I publish will turn up there. Or I guess if you just Google me, you can see my current academic profile at my page at Loyola, where it will have my most recent stuff, including my talks and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you. And to your earlier question about, I don't know if I've read your papers, but I have, and they're fascinating and they're eminently readable, even for an amateur like me. So thank you for that work. And thank you for defending sentiocentrism.
So one more shout out to John Nolt. He was sort of my mentor all through graduate school. He's an odd duck. So he was a logician and like Nietzsche scholar and metaphysician turned environmentalist because of his children and what he saw happening like in the 70s. So he approaches environmental ethics like very rigorously from a kind of analytic point of view that's deeply informed how I work. And I've always emphasized sort of trying to make my stuff readable, deep, but readable even by like just generally educated people that don't have that kind of specialization. I've always thought it was problematic how academics jargonese everything they say to make really simple points sound much more complicated than they actually are. That's the kind of gatekeeping that I think we need to get rid of where we can.
Yeah, I agree. It's much appreciated. Well, thank you. It's been a genuine inspiration. Great to talk to you, and please do stay in touch. And thank you for being a guest on Sentientism.